Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fenske. This evening, the Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation will release its 2019 Places in Peril list. These are places threatened by deterioration, lack of maintenance, insufficient funding, imminent demolition, and development. By publishing the list, the Alliance hopes to bring attention to their tenuous existence and save them before it's too late. Joining us to give a sneak peek at some of the St. Louis places on this year's list is Bill Hart. He's the Executive Director of Missouri Preservation. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So this list, I know it's still under wraps.
It's a secret.
But we do know a little bit about it. We know that it runs a wide gamut, from a long-shuttered restaurant in North St. Louis to homes in Wildwood, and then some places elsewhere in the state as well. Are there any common threads to what we're seeing in Peril this year?
Actually, it's pretty much all over the place. We have a couple of churches. We have a couple of WPA sites. One that was a municipal site. One that was actually a county-wide site. We have a farm on the list. We have several mid-century modern. We're seeing more mid-century modern nominations.
These are places that aren't that old then.
That's right. To be considered eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, in most cases, property must be at least 50 years old. Okay. So all of those places, those ranch houses from the 1950s and 60s are coming of age and are now considered historic.
So help us understand. I know a lot of people in St. Louis, we have a great love for our houses from, say, the 1870s. But when it comes to something like a mid-century ranch, something built in the 1950s, why should we care if this thing is knocked down?
Well, we care about historic places for a number of reasons. It's old stuff matters because it's important to the community, because it's a courthouse that people have grown up using. It's a church that have been raised in, a theater where you might have gone on your first date or maybe even gotten your first kiss. It's important to history, obviously, for events. We've had Civil War battlefields on our list of places in peril. We've had, there are other places like, notwithstanding the George Washington slept here kind of places. One of our state parks and historic places is the birthplace and the home of Harry Truman, one of our past presidents.
So that's pretty important. A famous person got their grounding somewhere.
Absolutely. Old buildings give us a sense of place. They can't be replicated in any other place. They're unique to our own neighborhood, our own hometown. And of course, they're important because we don't want to lose them. They're a vital part of strong communities in Missouri. Historic places increase tourism universally throughout Missouri and America. Old buildings are environmentally responsible. You don't have to get all new materials. You can renovate an existing building that has that saves important and non-renewable resources from being thrown into a landfill or
we don't
a
have to
dumpster.
Throw away our houses like
Exactly.
we throw away everything else in America.
And we don't have to create new non-renewable building materials to put in our historic buildings. And it makes economic sense. And in most cases, especially if buildings are recognized as important by the National Park Service by being put on the National Register of Historic Places, they're eligible for financial incentives like the historic preservation tax credits that Missouri is in the forefront of, and the federal government has been issuing since the 1980s.
So what do you see as a bigger threat in the work that you do? Is it a hot real estate market where somebody just wants to move out the old thing, or is it more abandonment and neglect like we see in many corners of St. Louis?
Well, that's a part of it, and everybody a lot of redevelopment is, we feel, inappropriate, and at least one of them on the list of local St. Louis places we think is very inappropriate. in some places, whole neighborhoods, and just I even had one lady call me up and said, "Can I nominate my town to your places in peril?" Because a lot of rural, a lot of rural places are emptying out for one reason or another: the loss of factory jobs, the loss of family farms, any number of reasons is seeing population, especially in rural areas, dwindle.
Now, you mentioned this idea of an inappropriate development. I'd like to just charge right into this list. And I know the overall list, you're not releasing that yet, but you are willing to talk about some of the St. Louis places on it. What is an example of something that is being threatened by inappropriate development?
Well, in one case, we had a nomination for a place in Kansas City that was actually, it was an old farm, and several of the barns still existed on this old farm. Well, they were surrounded by tract homes that have sprung up because the land of from the farm had been subdivided. So that we consider inappropriate. If new construction threatens existing historic resources, we would consider that inappropriate development.
You would like to see people building where there isn't something already.
Or incorporate the historic resource into your new construction.
Okay. Well, so let's talk about some of the things on the list. I understand that there is a Rolla place on the list this year. We do have a lot of listeners in Rolla, and I'd love to talk about the Holloway House. There
is the Holloway House in Rolla. It was a part once of a 250-acre cattle farm. It was built circa 1900. It is on a tract of land that part of it was subdivided back in the 60s and has some of Rolla's really finest mid-century homes on it. The rest of the acreage, the city wants to demolish the house to build a senior center. And while we don't disagree that we need services for seniors, this is a small town and there are lots of other available property in order to build this. And actually, the Rolla Preservation Alliance did a public poll of the residents in the city, and it was revealed that 70% of the respondents were in favor of saving the building and constructing the seniors housing center elsewhere.
Why? Any idea of why this caught Rolla's eye, that they want this particular?
Well, there's just obviously a disconnect between the planning community and the preservation community here.
Yeah.
And
but 70%, that's a pretty good poll number.
70% of those, I think there were 471 people who were polled, agreed that the building should be saved. And this is in a town where it used to be on Route 66, and a lot of those resources have gone by the wayside. And frankly, a lot of Rolla's downtown has suffered because the university's campus has really encroached upon the downtown.
Okay. So different things can put a place in peril. Can you talk to us at all about the Second Baptist Church here in the city of St. Louis?
Oh, yes. The Second Baptist Church is an architectural treasure. It was built in 1907, designed by the local firm of Moran, Russell, and Garden. It's a part of a National Register historic district called Holy Corners, if you're familiar with St. Louis. That Holy Corners consists of about 5 corners in the Central West End near McPherson and Kings Highway, consisting of an old Jewish synagogue, a Methodist church, a Masonic temple, a Church of Christ Scientist, and of course the Second Baptist Church here.
So all these different faiths right there.
And they're all right on these corners, and they're all really hugely significant and substantial buildings. This building, unfortunately, suffering from demolition by neglect. It's owned by a developer who hasn't really seen to maintenance of the building very much. So our listing is not only to recognize that it's imperiled, but to also encourage the owner to do ongoing maintenance and protect the building, and perhaps maybe market it to somebody who might be interested in doing,
because that's kind of a hot area right there.
It's an awesome neighborhood, yes.
So you mentioned that it's already in this district that is nationally registered. Doesn't that give some protections where this developer has to maintain some standards?
That's a very often asked question, as a matter of fact, because a lot of people think that because something is recognized as nationally significant, that the National Register of Historic Places recognizes it. It's the list of the federal government's historic properties that they deem worthy of preservation. So in and of itself, it's basically a list.
Okay.
Nobody comes and tells you what to do with your property unless, of course, you're using a federal government program or federal dollars. So basically, listing on the National Register only protects you from the government. But there are local laws that do have a lot more teeth, and people think, like I said, that the national laws kind of supersede these local laws. But indeed, the local preservation laws, ordinances that recognize historic buildings and protect historic buildings are actually a lot tougher because they're enacted by people like us. We write the laws, or have our aldermen write the laws that protect these local places. So
the developer maybe couldn't just knock this down, but he can let it.
He could certainly knock it down if he wanted,
Okay.
and he's sort of, in some people's opinion, doing that by letting it sit there and kind of deteriorate on its own.
Okay, so you're hoping to bring some attention to that
Absolutely.
situation. Going to a suburb of St. Louis, the Shanley Building.
The Shanley Building. This has been recognized with national architectural awards. It was designed by local Darling architect Harris Armstrong in 1935. It is St. Louis's earliest international style building, perhaps the earliest international style building in the Midwest.
Wow, so this is really significant. How does it end up in Peril?
Well, the property was owned, obviously is in the middle of downtown Clayton.
And
where
that's
there are
hot right
where
now.
There are lots of development pressures. The owner at first planned a residential and a hotel tower on the site. From what I've heard recently, only one of the towers is to be built. And we feel like this would be a really, keeping the Shanley House as maybe the entrance to a hotel or an apartment building would be a great way to recognize and appreciate the historic nature of the neighborhood.
So we could kind of have our cake and eat it too.
Absolutely.
We don't have to stop
so.
the hotel to save this building.
Indeed.
What about the de Hodiamont House?
The de Hodiamont House is possibly St. Louis's oldest residential building.
Wow.
Yes.
For St.
indeed.
Louis, that's got to be pretty old. It's an old city.
Exactly. It was, from what we can tell, it was there by 1830. It was probably built in about 1828. It was built by Baron Emmanuel de Hodiamont. It was originally a kind of stone vernacular building that was enlarged and modified in the 1870s. So its appearance today is of Gothic revival style, which still in and of itself is a rare example here in the city of St. Louis.
And why is it in peril?
It is in peril because of where it is. It's in a neighborhood that probably is not up to par with a lot of other St. Louis neighborhoods, market value wise.
This is in North St. Louis City.
It's in the West End. It's actually in the Northwest End. It's not an impossible candidate for renovation, and we're hoping that by listing it here, that we can lure a possible buyer or a customer to the developer who owns the building in order to have it restored.
And when you
put
say
back
we're
into-
looking for a possible buyer, this historically significant house, are we talking millions of dollars? Any sense of?
Probably not $1 million.
Okay,
no.
so
That's
this is
a pretty
feasible.
small house. It's a pretty small and reasonable sized house. So
Back in the 1820s, they
yes.
kept it little.
It's waiting for you.
Let's move right along to our next thing. The Sarah Lou Cafe. I know this has been on your list in the past.
It is. This is the second year that it's been on. This is a wonderful resource. It still
and
has,
what a history.
It still has the sign out in front from when it was a restaurant that says Sarah Lou Cafe, Chicken and Frogs.
That's so classic.
It's at Sarah and St. Louis Avenues, hence its name, Sarah Lou.
And that's again in North St. Louis City.
It's in North St. Louis City. It's the only building on the four corners of commercial buildings, though, that is substandard. All the rest of the buildings, all the other three corners are stable. So it could once again could be a really solidifying kind of resource in the neighborhood. Northside Community Housing has an option with the LRA to purchase the building. So
the LRA is the city's land reutilization
yes,
authority,
which owns probably the most vacant real estate in the city of St. Louis, 15,000 buildings maybe.
So here we've got a nonprofit group that is making some moves towards trying to purchase this.
Yes, they want.
Why should we be afraid then? It sounds like here's the happy ending.
Well, the money.
Yeah.
So
I was afraid you'd say that.
We're trying to provide more visibility for this historic place, so that Northside Community Housing can get the traction that it needs in order to raise some funds to renovate this, to use it for perhaps a business on the first floor and affordable housing on the rest of the building.
And the Sarah Lou Cafe had an amazing history. If you can believe what you read online, at least, it seems like a lot of celebrities had a meal at this place.
A very long history. And as a matter of fact, one of the people at Northside actually grew up in the neighborhood and remembers going in there, and told us exactly where everything was positioned and the tables were and where you would get your carry out. It's just a really, again, it's one of those places that matters because it's important to him. It's important to him and his neighbors.
And that one, it feels like it's important to a lot of people in that neighborhood.
Absolutely. It could be a solidifying source and a stabilizing force in the neighborhood.
Now, one of the most interesting inclusions on this list, tell us about Westland Acres.
Westland Acres is, I think, returning for its third year on our list of places in peril. It's a residential subdivision, approximately 130 acres on the border of the villages of Chesterfield and Wildwood in St. Louis County.
So this is, again, a really hot housing area.
It is the land of McMansions. It is obviously in suburban West County. It contains a handful of 2- and 3-bedroom, very modest wood frame homes tucked into the woods along Church Road. It's anchored on the west end of the subdivision by the Union Baptist Church, which was reconstructed actually in 1984 after the old one burned. There's a cemetery there which contains the graves of people dating from possibly the 1870s.
Wow.
The Westland was established in 1881 when William West, who was a freedman from the Daniel Boone settlement across the river, bought some land from Mr. Long, and he and his wife Polly, as I said, recently freed slaves, purchased the 150 acres from Norris Long.
That's a terrific backstory right there.
Absolutely. So it's a really significant historic African-American neighborhood. The community has now dwindled to under 10 families, and though Westland does retain its historic ties with the descendants of William West, a lot of the people who live in Westland Acres are kind of being priced out of their neighborhood, out of their own neighborhood.
And they own these houses. Is this just
They've
taxes
owned them.
or too
Their
high?
families own them, yes.
Property taxes.
One of the people there told us that she had to refinance her house twice in order to pay her real estate tax bill.
Oh, what a nightmare situation.
So we're hoping that we can get somebody in the county council to listen to us, to perhaps provide some sort of freezing of the tax rate for these people until such time as they may want to build their own McMansion on their own property or sell the property to somebody who wants to.
And then they can sell by choice.
And then, yeah, absolutely. That way, it's their choice to move from the neighborhood, and it's not a demand because of their finances.
We're talking today with Bill Hart. He's the executive director of Missouri Preservation, and he's giving us a sneak peek at some of the 2019 places in peril. Bill, there's another place on this list that's just a little bit west of St. Louis. It's called the Emmaus Houses.
The Emmaus Homes. The Emmaus Homes started as a campus in 1859 with the completion of about five campus buildings for the German Evangelical Church of the Midwest. The German Evangelical Church eventually became the United Church of Christ, and the seminary actually became Eden Seminary and moved to St. Louis in the 1890s. So when it was vacated by the seminary in 1893, it was established as the evangelical home for the epileptic and feeble-minded. So for many years, it served as a group home and institution for developmentally disabled people. As we all know, there's been a paradigm shift in how we deal with our friends and our family who are developmentally disabled.
We're no longer institutionalizing
We're not
them.
institutionalizing them, and the last resident of the Emmaus homes moved last year. So leaving the campus, which includes several modern buildings now, lodge-type buildings, a chapel from 1928, and several other buildings, leaving them all vacant.
Oh, wow.
They have been determined eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The campus has, so they would be eligible for the tax credits to a would-be developer. So we're hoping to find one that's preservation friendly in the because there's some really significant German vernacular and German Baroque style architecture here on the campus, and it's in Marthasville in Warren County.
How long of a drive is that from St. Louis City?
It's probably about 40 minutes from St. Louis, not very far.
So for a developer who's into preservation, this could be a really nice place.
It could be a wonderful country club resort. It could be has lots of acreage that goes along with it. Some of it which is very nicely landscaped. So it could include a golf course. I think it could be a great place, and Missouri's viticulture is blossoming once again, and it could be a great place for a winery or a distillery or any of those kinds of places.
That's now we've got one more St. Louis place on the list, but this is more than just one place. This is a giant collection.
Oh my goodness!
Tell us about the homes that are owned by the Land Reutilization Authority of St. Louis, which is called the LRA.
Yes, the LRA owns at least 12,000 parcels, 11 to 12,000 parcels of vacant property in the St. Louis area. It was set up during the mass exodus during the 1960s of population from the city when there was an alarming number of buildings being vacated, and they were actually dumped on the city and taken by the city for back taxes. The city, with its dwindling population, hasn't been able to really afford to own these buildings, so
they're not maintaining them.
They're trying to. Okay. We'll put it that way. There's not a huge budget for that, and there's never been a budget for marketing these buildings. Most of the buildings that we are highlighting were probably built between 1870 and 1950, and they're on St. Louis's north side, which is the oldest part of St. Louis. It's also it was also one of the most affluent neighborhoods in St. Louis in the day, and has some very significant architecture. There, as I said, there are lots of foreclosures there that leaving the city owning properties, and the city of St. Louis announced a plan to spend $13.6 million a year over 20 years to demolish potentially thousands of historic buildings on the north side of St. Louis.
So these buildings really are in peril. The city actually has some money or a plan to try to use money to do this.
Yes. Well, at the same time, the Metropolitan Sewer District has a mandate to manage storm water runoff. Traditionally, and in my own house, I live in a historic district in the city of St. Louis, and my stormwater from my roof goes right down into the sewer. So all of this clean water that could potentially be trapped and sent right back to the river and the runoff is going into our sewer lines where it has to be processed. So the MSD provided funding to help demolish these buildings so as to create a natural runoff. And of course, it sounds like the best thing since sliced bread to the city because it gets rid of this big problem for them over 20 years, taking care of a lot of substandard buildings.
Along the same lines, in July, the city launched a new initiative called the St. Louis Blight Authority, created by Twitter founder Jack Dorsey and Detroit investor Bill Pulte. It's begun demolishing vacant buildings in the Wells Goodfellow neighborhood. The mayor thinks this is a great thing.
Sounding like a good thing.
Yeah. What do you say to that?
I think it's frightening. So far, Missouri Preservation is one of the only organizations besides private citizens that have really outed these people for their potential demolition of these thousands of potentially historic buildings. the editorial board of the Post-Dispatch seems to be ardently behind all of this demolition. It's like a party. It's like a demolition party. And no matter how many times somebody writes an editorial or somebody tweets about how wonderful it is that we're getting rid of the blight in St. Louis, we're getting rid of a very important, not only historical resource, but economic resource. Once a building, first of all, it's going to cost to tear these buildings down, okay? So that's money that might go in to preserving these buildings, to stabilizing some of them. And instead, we'll end up with empty lots. And if you live in the city of St. Louis and you own property, you know that your house or your condo is assessed for real estate taxes every year. It's called improvements on your property. Improved property yields more potential for income, for tax income, than unimproved property. An empty lot is worth very little and will yield very little in property taxes over the years to St. Louis citizens.
So we have time for just one more question today. But as we're looking at this year's list, it just feels almost overwhelming, all these places that are in peril. What are some specific steps we can take here to make sure that we don't lose all these places forever?
Well, pass local laws that protect historic buildings, make buildings eligible for financial incentives by trying to get them nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. Urge your officials to step up efforts to preserve rather than obliterate historic resources, and fight the good fight out there.
Bill Hart, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about endangered historic places in Missouri, the places that are really important to all of Missouri citizens. Thank you.
Bill is the Executive Director of Missouri Preservation, and you can read more about the 2019 Places in Peril as of tonight at preservemo.org. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.